All right, it's Gabriot here with another expert guide geared at Covenant 25. But as always, if you're on the lower covenants, these guides work just fine. You can follow them to a T and it should help you climb those covenants. So today we're looking at the Primordium. I'm specifically looking at the exiled Umbra and the exiled Awoken combo. But, you can pretty much apply this general strategy to any secondary clan. I just found Awoken to be the most consistent due to the high value banner units available to Awoken, in particular Animus of Will and the sweeper units. They work quite nicely with Primordium. We're going to get all into that in a bit here, but yeah, without any further ado, let's get to it. There should be chapter markers below, so if you ever, it's going to be a long video, as these always are. Feel free to skip around, come back to it later. I'm also, be sure, if you want, toward the very end of the video, I'm going to do something new. I'm going to do a little bit of a statistical analysis on the run that I did. So the run I'm interested in here is I went on a 21-10 run with a 7-1 win streak on Covenant 25 using this combo with the strategies outlined in this guide. And I just want to show kind of what the data shows with, granted there's a little variance, but we'll get on to that in a bit. So here we go. What are the strengths and weaknesses of this combo? So Primordium, nice thing about this champ is it's not one of those champs where you want one particular path. The ideal path is actually to take 1 superfood and 2 stalwart. So you can start with either of them. I recommend if you see superfood to lock it in ASAP, but either one's going to work. And so let's say, you start stalwart or you start superfood. The next 2 level ups, you just want to lock in the other one if you can see it. Sometimes you'll low roll and you'll lose both 50-50s there. It happens, but the majority of the time it's not going to happen. So there's a lot of consistency in getting a good version of the champ. And also, when you have at least one into the superfood, the statistic or our status effect transferring is just, it can be so insanely powerful, particularly the multi-strike and damage shield. If there's the Furnace Tap card. If you can put that on Primordium, it's just ridiculous. You could almost, the game kind of plays itself at that point. You can still lose. I mean, I've definitely lost with Furnace Tap on my superfood Primordium, but it's certainly hard to, let's put it that way. And everything else plays pretty nicely too. I didn't list out everything here. These are the 5 I typically found were the most useful. Rage has a really nice interaction where if you stick it on Primordium, you're going to get that flat attack boost that he's getting from Rage. And then on top of that, you're going to get that Rage transferred over to your unit and it'll keep stacking. So Rage can really scale out your attack pretty quickly. And you need it. You're going to want Rage no matter what, really. But there's a lot of good Rage applications available with the Emberdrain cards. Spikes is like less insane, I'd say, because you typically don't want to be getting hit with your carry unit. But it's definitely pretty good in the early to mid game when you don't really have all the components ready. Stacking spikes can pretty much clean up most of the early game shit. And lifesteal, between lifesteal and damage shield, I prefer damage shield because it sort of stacks better. And if you do happen to get stacking multi-strike, damage shield still plays nicely with it. Whereas lifesteal will kind of lose all of its stacks. But that being said, lifesteal, similar to spikes, stacking it early can pretty much carry you through the early to mid game. And also, particularly with the stalwart, sometimes you're going to have to start stalwart. You might get stalwart twice in a row before you can get superfood, or maybe you'll just get stuck with stalwart the whole way. In those cases, you're not going to be able to do any of these, but you're still going to have a lot of flat stat increases that Awoken excels at. Root seeds is going to guarantee to be there. Early game especially, just sticking root seeds on your Primordium. Typically, I just put a Primordium at the top, put a Train Steward there, start sticking root seeds on Primordium, and you should be able to take on pretty much any early game trial. The only early game trial you're going to have troubles with is armor. but I'll get into the trials later. And Razor Sharp Edge is a pretty prime one. Even like Steel Enhancer's surprisingly good here because it just keeps stacking upon itself. So that's kind of the strengths. Just being able to scale insanely and just create a crazy carry unit is basically the goal of this strategy. Now, weaknesses. It certainly has its weaknesses. You know, I've done a few guides now. I think this is a pretty strong strategy, but I wouldn't list it as like one of the strongest in terms of consistency because the weaknesses are so prevalent. You know, granted, I did get around a 67% win rate. I actually think if I kept playing, it would normalize to a bit lower. I think I was getting a little bit lucky on my furnace taps. We'll get into that later. But anyway, the weaknesses. Big thing is Plink. I really don't like this card. It really does work in the first 2 circles as long as you don't get the armor trial, of which it pretty much nullifies its uselessness or its usefulness. But you know, other than that, your Plink will be pretty good in those first 2 circles. Even the first boss, it can do some work on. But past that, it falls off harder than any basic card. I'd say even more than the Stygian Spear. So it becomes utterly useless outside of pouring upgrades into it. Plink is a pretty good target for that plus 20, the what do you call it, Surge Stone, plus 20 damage consume. Plus 10 damage is okay too, but I generally want to prioritize other things above Plink. So as you know, as a result, I actually found a lot more success when I was removing Plinks even before Stewards. At least a Steward you can put down, it might do some damage, and then it'll be out of your deck for that fight. But Plink just stays in your deck at the basic version, and it does nothing for, you know, from Circle 4 onward, it literally does nothing. Really, really bad card. So that's definitely a weakness. And also, Morsel Generation, as you know, usually with Umbra, a lot of the play revolves around stacking a bunch of morsels onto a bunch of Gorge units. I didn't really find that was very doable here. A lot of Umbra units that typically can be pretty good, I didn't really find very powerful in this combo. So like, the Crucibles are still great, but like Overgorger, which is normally a really good unit, didn't find it that good in this combo. The Alloy, the one that needs fuel, pretty hard to give it enough fuel to really make it be much of a focal point of your deck. So Morsel Generation definitely seems a bit weak here. That's partially because of Plinks, and partially because you can only focus on so many things at once, and Morsels don't really fit into this game plan much, in my opinion. So you kind of want to just focus on this, and just I don't think Morsel Generation is really very beneficial here. And also the big thing here, it just doesn't have a very good way to kill tanks. Both of these classes don't really have any great spells that sort of kill tanks. You know, Stygian has a lot of good tank killing spells. Hellhorn has a few, but these really don't have any. You got Bramble Lash if you have spikes, but that's pretty conditional. You got Restoration Detonation, but I find you're usually not going to be typically missing health, so Restoration Detonation doesn't end up being that good. And Forever Consumed is an option, but it's not a very good option. Like you're typically leaning into Emberdrain, so you're never really going to have that much energy. You know, you usually just have your Perils energy, the 3 energy, and 30 damage per Ember really isn't going to do much against something like Gilded Wing late game. So unless you have really fast scaling, those tanks are going to do work on you. It's pretty common to not be at very high pyre health throughout the entire run, because at all stages, tanks kind of just the early, you know, first 2 wave tanks probably just going to march on by. They'll take a little bit of damage, but you won't be scaled enough by then unless you have some really good scaling, and they're just going to get some hits in. And mostly when I lost, it was because tanks just marched on by. This, you know, you don't really have any problem with AoE backliners. You don't have any problem killing bosses. It's really just tanks. So let's talk about Primordium. Really powerful champ, super powerful. I typically, as I said, always, if I see superfood, like, I'll lock that in early, because I do feel the superfood effect here is a lot more important than the other one, increasing its buffet. But and even then, like early on, it just gives better stats anyway, even if you don't have any status cards. So superfood early, I highly recommend. But if you don't see superfood, you're at least going to see stalwart. So I'd lock in stalwart. I wouldn't really ever go aggressive in this strategy, at least. It's not that aggressive is bad. It's just that if you lock that in, you're not going to get one of these. And getting locked in at 3 buffet for superfood is not great. And also just not having the option for superfood is not great. So that's why I say start either superfood or stalwart. And so the first level up, I would just, if you see, you know, whatever you started with, stalwart or superfood, I would lock in the other one. That way, you know, for your final upgrade, you can put it into whatever. Typically, I would say superfood 1, stalwart 2 is the ideal. I don't really value the initial damage shield very much. I'd rather just have extra buffet. That just, it compounds all the stacking that you can do, gives extra gorges if gorges are needed. Just better, but you know, you're not always going to get the ideal situation, and it's not uncommon for me to like have to start superfood and then I don't get offered stalwart until the end, or just ever offered it, like, and vice versa. But that's kind of the deal there. And some general tips here. So I generally say position at the top floor. There can be exceptions, like sometimes you can get away with it to start your sweepers at the bottom if they have quick, especially if there's units that are shuffling scourges into your deck. That might be a good exception, but in general, I would generally just position toward the top to give your unit time to scale. You know, you're going to let a lot of tanks by if you start at the bottom. And that's kind of the deal there. And it also gives you time if, you know, if say you have like cleanse Seraph, you'll have a few waves where he's not cleansing your stuff to kind of restack things if you need it. Just generally, yeah, generally good to start at the top. And I mentioned you have a strong first 2 circles because those plinks. So you can pretty much, you'll be good there, but I don't know what I'm saying here. What did I even write down here? Whatever. Fuck the second point. Don't worry about that. I can't read it right now. Remove plinks before stewards. Mentioned that before. Plinks just really bad. They fall off so quick. A steward can at least provide you some use, or at the very least sort of consume itself, right? And don't be afraid to pick a few good banner units toward the beginning. Yeah, so on the next page, it'll become a little bit more apparent, though. I typically have said the Awoken units are the top priority unit, but a lot of the time early on, even though you have those units, you may still have to rely on something like a Crucible, you know, Crucible Collector or Warden or whatnot, and you can remove them later on. The thing is, to take on Daedelus, to take on Talos, you're going to need some sort of sustain. Like, there's just too much HP to get through, so even if you have a nice Animus of Will or whatnot, it might not be enough unless you have some serious like damage shields scaling on and a superfood Primordium start. You probably want to be looking at, you know, adding some boss killing units, you know, the type of units that typically excel at killing bosses. And as I mentioned, you're going to be taking a lot of pyre damage, most likely. It's rare that you're going to be able to kill all the tanks. So target those pyre health things on the path, you know, the things that heal your pyre, blood pools or whatever. And even if you have a lot of health, it's not a bad call to get some buffer room, because there's might be a bad wave, or a bad set of waves that really take a toll on your pyre health. So let's get to the card choices. Emberdrain is king. It's generally any of these cards, particularly these 3 right here. Furnace Tap, Void Binding Perils. That's going to be the core of like an ideal setup. And these ones are all right too. I'll just kind of go through them one by one. Furnace Tap, it's pretty obvious. It's always good. Even if you don't have your superfood yet, you can still stick it on whatever, and it's adding multi-strike. It's pretty powerful. And if you have superfood, then you just sort of stick it on your Primordium and sit back and laugh. And and that's pretty much the deal there. Really good double stack target. Getting 2 multi-strike per turn is certainly a good thing if you weren't aware of that. Perils of Protection, very important part of this combo. If you want to be able to Furnace Tap early if you find it, you don't want to have to cycle all the way back through again. I also don't really like burning a Permafrost upgrade on it. Really just want double stack, and I want to play it when I see it. So I need stuff like Perils. Perils is going to be your best option to counter that Emberdrain. It'll give you 3 energy when you play it, so stick it on holdover if possible. And every turn you'll have 3 energy no matter how much Emberdrain you have, and you're gonna be Emberdrain beyond anything, especially with the superfood. If you didn't know, it stacks your debuffs too, so you'll have a lot of Emberdrain coming in. So those are 2 big ones. Void Binding is also pretty big. I should use Void Binding. It does everything. It gives you the defense. It gives you the offense. So to elaborate on that rage point, let's say you do have a stack of superfood. Rage 6 is going to add 12 damage to your Primordium if you stick it on it. On top of So basically what happens is when your unit consumes it, it gets that flat 12 damage increase permanently. Then it also gets the 6 rage transferred over for an additional 12. So every time you eat Void Binding, you're getting 24 damage. That's pretty good per turn. And on top of that, you're getting 2 damage shield per turn. Now let's say a double stack Void Binding. Now you're getting 4 damage shield per turn and 48 damage per turn. So Void Binding, pretty good card. Now these other ones aren't quite on the level of these, but they're still good. Immortal Trade, not going to add you any stats, but it particularly shines early game when you might not have all these components together. That's a lot of lifesteal actually for no energy cost. Even if you don't have a Perils or Mind Collapse or anything really to get your energy back, you can just stick this on your unit. You don't even have to put it on your Primordium. 2 Emberdrain is not too bad. You can recover from that. And, you can just apply it every now and then, and eventually you'll stack enough lifesteal that you can pretty much take on any boss. If you have Immortal Trades in your opener, you can pretty much take on the early game pretty easily, even with like a Trained Steward. And then, so we talked about Perils. Also worth note, it does have Rage as well. So that's going to be 8 damage per turn. I wouldn't really double stack it, but 8 damage per turn is nothing to really laugh at. That's good damage on top of getting your energy per turn. So Perils is very good. Now Ember Cache, not going to add you any stats, and it's also pretty slow. I wouldn't say it's like an amazing card, but it's something I'm not necessarily sad to see in at least one of them in my deck. It's slow in the sense that once you play it, there's no cost to really play it other than it took up another card being drawn, but after you cycle through your deck, those are some pretty powerful turns once those Excavated Embers hit. And you're not, even though Perils is a basic card, you're not always going to find it. There's plenty of runs I didn't find it, and I needed ways to still be able to play like at least Void Binding double stacked early, and Ember Cache is an option. Another option is Mind Collapse. Mind Collapse requires some upgrades, but slap a plus 10 damage on it. You can play it at 0 Ember, so at the start of the turn. And as long as you have a target, which usually you will, you'll gain 2 energy. So, it doesn't give you stats. It gives you 1 less energy. It requires some more upgrades, but it's still an okay option if you didn't find Perils, is Mind Collapse. And, if you don't find Perils, you might want to think about putting Mind Collapse on holdover. You'll usually pretty much guarantee a 2 energy per turn, unless it's like a down turn or whatnot. Because you do want consistent ways to get some energy. The other option, if you didn't find any of these, which happens, is to simply make as many spells as you can cost 0. Void Binding at 0 on holdover, if you never found any of these, is still pretty powerful. You're getting, as we said, 24 damage a turn, plus all that damage shield. That's pretty good still. So, status effects stacking. We'll go over this briefly, but Void Binding, we've kind of already talked about that, but all of these 4 here, I guess 5, Chain of Gems is actually really good for it too. These are all going to support the defensive component, which is getting damage shield. You can win without damage shield, but it sure does help to have it. It stacks so nicely, and it is not affected by any multi-strike you might end up having. And all of these are going to be good for it. Void Binding is always pretty much universal going to be the best way to apply your damage shield, especially considering the offensive stuff it gives. Prismal Dust is the second best option, I would say, but unless you're facing Cleanse Seraph, Cleanse Seraph probably would rather see these two than Prismal Dust, but it's not too big of a deal. The thing with Grovel and Gem Trove is they only apply 1 damage shield each, and I wouldn't really say they're necessarily even worth double stacking either. Gem Trove technically kind of applies 2, but you know, you more want that extra damage shield to be on your Primordium because that's what's going to be stacking each turn. But all that being said, these are all very good cards regardless. Gem Trove does usually require at least 1 Ember upgrade. I like to put 2 Ember upgrades on it. Grovel, I like to put at least 1. And if I'm facing Cleanse Seraph and I couldn't find Void Binding, I would consider, if I need the defense, to put either of these on holdover. Multi-strike, we already talked about Furnace Tap. It's god tier. Also, even though we're Awoken and Umbra, it's not out of the question that you get One Harm's Tome. Remember, there's several there's a few Cavern events that you can get it, and I had gotten it from time to time. You know, there's one where it just allows you to pick a Clan's Tome, and it's pretty nice to get One Harm's Tome. With all the damage shield you have, you're probably not too worried about Fragile. I generally want units to get quick anyway, so on top of the damage shield and the quickness, you're probably not too worried about Fragile. Stick 2 Ember upgrades on it, and it can be an option for multi-strike if you didn't find Furnace Tap. Or even if you did find it, having 2 options is never bad either. I should also mention, if you find Furnace Tap, it becomes a very high priority Hellvent target, because that's just going to double your chance of drawing it early, and the earlier you draw it, the better. Spikes, we kind of talked about this before, but they're just kind of okay. They're never like super insanely good, but early game they're certainly good. Like, you put a Sharpen on your Primordium if it has superfood, and that's giving you pretty decent amount of attack on top of just a lot of spikes. Those spikes are going to clear any AoE, and since you're getting at least 10 HP per turn, since you took superfood, you're going to be somewhat tanky no matter what unit you have. And bosses typically get wrecked by spikes because they just keep attacking it over and over again. So spikes will always be good. Cycle of Life is surprisingly pretty good too. I especially like it when I'm forced to start Stalwart and get stuck with it for maybe most of the run or even all the run. It won't really, I don't care too much about the spikes in that case, but that 10 health is pretty good. A Stalwart doesn't start with the extra health, remember, so that'll allow you to get a lot of razor sharp edges in if you need them. And then Immortal Trade, we kind of talked about that, but you can kind of play around with it if you want to apply it directly on yourself or your unit or Primordium. If you apply it on Primordium, just know you're probably going to be Ember Drained. If that's something you can deal with for the rest of the fight, then so be it. Maybe you need to do that sometimes just to get a crap load of lifesteal stacked. Otherwise, you can just play it on your unit for some pretty good lifesteal and a pretty minor Ember Drain, just to have the 2 Ember Drain. That's only going to last 2 turns, and you can play cards on either turn. It's just a little bit of an Ember Drain. It's not like Furnace Tap or anything where it's like you're guaranteed just to never have Ember again. The stat increases. All these are going to be... So the Awoken cards are going to give you the flat stat increases. Those work nice with all versions of Primordium, but particularly the Stalwart. Root Seeds is always going to be good. Early game, I'm always playing Root Seeds just to get that extra damage. Razor Sharp Edge is super good. You usually don't care too much about that minus to health. We talked about Sharpen. It's not actually... Sharpen's not insane, but it ends up just being kind of okay. It's not like a bad card to have. You don't want to really add too many to your deck, though. I wouldn't have more than 1 or 2. Steel Enhancer is surprisingly good in this. I've never, with my other strategies, typically targeted Steel Enhancer, but in this strategy I do kind of, if I see it, unless I have a bunch already, it's rare that I'll skip it. Like it's pretty good, especially with the stalwart path. You get that extra health that allows a few extra plays of razor sharp edge. Even if you don't have razor sharp edge, it's a lot of tankiness and a lot of damage for pretty much no cost. Pretty good early game. Late game, not quite as insane, but I still wouldn't like remove it from my deck. It's still pretty useful. Talked about cycle of life. Adaptive, it's a bit situational, but there's a lot of situations where it can give you that early boost to damage that you might need just to take on some of those early tanks. Particularly if you want like large stone on your unit, it can give you a nice, like, you know, arguably 20 or 30 damage, and if you have any amount of multi-strike, it just helps all the better there. Sometimes you can also play it depending on the weirdness of how your stat layout is. Like if you have a lot of cycles of life or something, you could use it on your Primordium to just have a lot of extra damage as well. And then these also, even if you do go stalwart, but particularly if you go superfood, these, as we talked about, the rage is going to give you a lot of extra flat attack, just because it's that flat attack that the rage adds to your Primordium gets transferred over. And hammered chest plates, which I typically have never found this artifact good, is actually pretty decent. I found in this this combo, just having that extra 3 right off the bat to your Primordium, you know, not really super noticeable late game, but early game, that can, early to mid game, that extra 3, you know, it's compounded per turn, so it's actually a lot of extra health. Pretty nice to see it, actually. Also, you know, if you have razor sharp edge, which you typically want, if you see it, it's pretty high priority add. You know, it gives you an extra 1 to 2 stacks of it that you can play. And card draw, another thing that Awoken excels at. Root Seeds give you a nice built-in card draw engine. Preserve Thorns, an invigorating solution, always super high value card draw cards. They cost nothing, they don't need any upgrades. They're nice counters to Consume Seraph. Just really good cards overall. And Awoken Rail Spike, kind of hit or miss, I'd say, but never really bad to include in a deck. It never is like a negative thing, I say, but sometimes it just sort of breaks even. And then Vine Mother, and sometimes just adding a sting is fine, but Vine Mother, I've always loved Vine Mother. We'll get to the data later. It's possible I took it too much in my runs, but there's a lot of variance, so it's hard to evaluate. To me, it's a pretty good unit because it provides some early game tankiness if you need to put a unit behind it. You know, you're not always, especially early game, it's not uncommon to have like 3 banner units and later on just remove them. Just because you might not have the sustain needed to get through the bosses, so you might need a Vine Mother sort of with another unit behind it, like an Animus of Will or something, and then you'll have like a Crucible on the top with the Primordium. But the nice thing about Primordium or Vine Mother is it provides that tankiness for whatever unit's behind it, while also basically upgrading your draw at that point, from that point on, and giving a nice free 10 damage each turn. Usually it's not too much of a problem to see those stings cycle back through the deck. And then in Snare, I'm becoming to love this card more and more. It's just a low-key, really good card. Has no real investment to have in your deck. The drop +1 next turn, similar to Sting, it really helps fill up your hand the following turn, but as we talked about, the problem with the tanks, Ensnare helps a lot with mitigating that. Especially if you draw, when you draw early, you can just ensnare like maybe a shield unit or some other unit that's like gonna buff up the tank, or just ensnare the tank itself and just stall basically for another turn to like let your multi-strike stack or your void binding stack, something like that. And ensnare just helps a lot with that. It costs nothing, doesn't need any upgrades, really good card. And then Thorn Fruit, similar to Vine Mother, just an upgrade basically to your draw for free. Not a bad thing to give, and it gives extra damage here and there. So that's card draw. You're always going to have pretty good card draw. And then AoE / just any other thing that seemed kind of useful. Glimmer, it's always useful no matter what no matter what you're doing. Early on, it'll do work. Mid to late game, it does want a plus 10 damage, definitely. But, it's not too hard to find those. Worst comes to worst, you can always make it a Surge Stone target if that's all you're getting offered. Quick is okay. I would say, as far as the Merchants of Steel are concerned, Quick is actually the top target in this strategy, I would say, even more so than multi-strike, because you just want to be able to attack it, especially if you got the sweepers. You want to be able to attack everything before it hits you. And then also on that note, if you do have a sweeper as your carry unit, you're going to want, you would like to see Umbra Stone. It is kind of a pseudo multi-strike the way the mechanic works. Basically the way it works is if you're a sweeper unit, let's say you're fighting a tank and you can't kill it. You're about like half damage off killing it. Maybe you need just a little under half damage. But then there's a backline unit that has like 2 health. Well, in that case, if you have Trample, it carries over the damage from that backline unit. And if there's 2, it'll carry both of them over. Right back to that frontline tank. So it actually ends up doing double to triple damage sometimes to that tank. And seeing as tanks are the problem, this can be a way to solve them. In Timber Assault, I said morsel generation isn't really that good or needed, but that being said, it's still an okay card to have in your deck. Definitely not as high value as it is typically in Umbra, but still like pretty decent card. Pretty good way to get to the back line. I don't find I put holdover on it as much as I would typically with Umbra, but every night you can put a Surge Stone or a plus 10 damage upgrade and it's relevant late game. Sometimes those morsels can help with things. Feast is okay. It's never insane, but it can be a nice way to speed up your scaling if you need it. Never that sad to see a Feast, but probably wouldn't add more than like 1 to your deck. Wretch, on the other hand, is really good. Pretty good permafrost target. Wretch is a nice way to get around not finding much stalwart stacks, or not any. If you had to get stuck with like Superfood 2 or Superfood 3, Wretch is a nice way to mitigate the downside there. One thing you'll have to remember with Wretch, though, is if you play it back into the top floor, you're going to transfer that dazed back over. So sometimes you can deal with that, sometimes you can't. If you don't think you can typically, but you think you really need to rely on Wretch for your strategy, you should consider probably putting your units on the mid floor or bottom, whatever makes sense there. But yeah, Wretch is nice because it brings the, you put permafrost on it, you can wait until your Primordium is eaten up, and then you can shuffle it right back into your deck. Space Prism, even though we're typically doing the ideal strategy is by end game is just to have the 1 carry unit, that way you're guaranteed to have it in your opener and scale it as fast as possible. The ideal isn't always going to happen, and Space Prism is a nice card to get around that. It doesn't need any upgrades, it's free to play, and it can allow you to basically start building kind of a super floor if you need it. You'll always have a pretty good frontliner, but maybe you can stick something behind it, like Animus of Will or something, or Dante, and then, or even just if you wanted space to like put morsels in, it's good for that. And then Blazing Bolts and Excavation Eruption, these can be okay options to deal some either AoE or deal with some tanks. They particularly are good against tanks if you can eliminate like the backline units before you play them. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I'll have like a Vine Mother or some other tank in front with a sweeper behind it on like floor 2 or floor 1, killing all the low health units, and then my unit at top is just scaling to get ready to finish off the tanks. In those cases, Blazing Bolts and Excavation Eruption can do some pretty decent damage. I would say both of them want kind of 2 Ember upgrades, in my opinion, just to make them cheap to play. But that's kind of the thoughts there. So let's talk about the carry units, the banner units. by far the best one's going to be Animus of Will. You should jump for joy if you see it. I would almost say no matter what you've done, I'd always take it. Yeah, you know, even if I poured like upgrades into my crucibles that I've been building, or some of these sweeper units, I would still take it if I see it, just because it's so powerful. Animus of Will is, and you know, you don't have to immediately player. You can still go with your game plan on these, and maybe it ends up just not being needed. But I think it's worth always picking at least once if you can see it. Well, not at least only once. I mean, you don't want to pick like 2 of them. But yeah, Animus of Will is the best. It has the built-in multi-strike. You don't even need Furnace Tap if you have Animus of Will. Simply just let the stats build and you're going to be good. She really likes to see quick, and I think also Large Stone. Large Stone gives the best, you know, initial spike to your damage. But even like a +10 damage can be okay. The main thing is just quick. And honestly, with every unit, quick is going to be the upgrade that you want to see most. You know, like these sweeper units, for example. That'll make it so if you're stacking damage shields, you don't lose them, because you only lose them if you can't kill the units. And usually you'll be able to kill them by mid to end round. And then that damage shield is going to be what allows you to take on the bosses, the damage shield that you preserved. But anyway, so Animus of Will, just a really great unit. But also these sweeper units, and I put Dante in only theoretically. I will say I never really used him, but you know, it's basically doing what Animus of Will does, but a bunch better. I just typically found I would find Animus of Will. If I had found Animus of Will, I just didn't see a point to include Dante. But that being said, if I only had like maybe Crucible, or even worse, like something not on here, I might consider taking those Dante candles. The Dante candles do suck to like deal with, but you'll be guaranteed to win if you can get Dante pretty much, because that's just so much stats that are going to be stacking. But yeah, these sweeper units, I would say typically Shattered Shell is going to be better, but it's not as theoretically it's not as like big of a difference as you'd think. You're getting far much more scaling just from Primordium than you are from a measly like +3 per slay. But that being said, because it has that +3 per slay, it is preferable to Husk Hermit. But I would say, like, if I've poured like a quick upgrade and maybe a multi-strike upgrade into Husk Hermit already, and I saw a Shattered Shell, I probably wouldn't take a Shattered Shell in that case, because there's not enough difference there for me to really want Shattered Shell versus Husk Hermit. Now, if I saw Animus of Will, I might still take her. But that's kind of the deal there. And then on the decent side, we got the 2 Crucibles. Typically, I'd say Collector's the best. It's really going to carry you through the mid to early game. They're not really on the level of the Awoken units, though, because without Furnace Tap, they're really not going to have the late game carry potential that these units have. They're really going to struggle, especially when you see like 2 tanks in a wave right in front of one another. Like, even if they had, say, 1 multi-strike unit upgrade or whatnot, you know, if you didn't find Furnace Tap, you can only get so much damage so quick, and they're going to struggle there. They're still going to crush bosses, right? But it's really they just kind of struggle with the tank killing potential. I also listed Overgorger. It's tough because, like, there's a few problems with him. He starts, you know, compared to these other units, he's an additional pip space and also an additional ember cost. So any early game scaling that might cost ember, you might be missing out on with Overgorger. But, you know, theoretically you could get his just attack naturally up a lot. The problem is, as I said, the morsel generation isn't really consistent, and I never found Overgorger to actually get gorged enough to really survive to a point where I could really use him. Usually I would choose him and then just abandon him in favor of like an Animus of Will, or I would lean into him because he was my only option. and I would just sort of lose because it was too hard to get them going. And that's kind of it there. That I should say, let's say you do find Furnace Tap. If you got a good double stacked Furnace Tap, you got a unit with Quick on it, you got Superfood, it almost doesn't matter the unit that you have at that point. Like, you could really use any unit at that point. You could use a Vine Mother as your main unit at that point, and you're going to win probably, as long as you have some damage scaling to go along with it. But these should be your targets, really, these three, and then these two, I would say. Crucible Collector, Animus of Will, Sweepers. Crucible, and I should also mention, early game, you really want to maybe see, like, I wouldn't skip Crucible Collector if I saw it early game, even if I had an Animus of Will. Unless I was pretty confident that Animus of Will could, like, take on Daedalus, I would need, like, some pretty good damage shield scaling. But if I didn't have that, I should still lean on Crucible Collector as my route to get through the early game. And I guess that kind of is what I'm going over here too. Like, if you don't have consistent damage shield or lifesteal, like if you have early immortal trades, you're probably fine. Even with Animus of Will, who has multi-strike, if you can stack that immortal trade a few times, you're going to have enough damage to probably take on Daedalus and whatnot, or Talos. But if you don't have those, you want these Crucibles, or just something that's good at killing tanks. Sometimes even like an Awoken Hollow or Awoken Thorned Hollow, if you have the support to make those work, can work. And I didn't list regen, but that's also another thing that you can stack. I didn't list it because I really didn't find myself using it that much, but it is an option. Like, if you start Superfood and you have like Wildwood Saps in your opener, you could start with like an Awoken Hollow. I would still prioritize like Crucibles and the other units over it if you see them. But if you don't see them, you could start with like one of the Hollows and just stack regen, and you'll be fine to get through that mid to early game as well. Maybe even the whole game. But yeah. Basically, you just even if you got those good units, you don't want to let any of these bosses get you by surprise. Even Arceus and Fel had caught me by surprise a few times. I had like a Husk Hermit that I thought was good, but I really had no sustain, and Arceus just has so much health. It's like without any sustain, even if you have an insane unit, you're gonna have troubles there. You do need some sort of sustain. So let's get on to the unit upgrades. I've kind of mentioned this before, but Speedstone Quick is going to be the biggest thing you want to hunt for. That's just going to be so beneficial to you, especially with those high value units. You may not need it as much if you have like Crucible Collector, because he's got that built-in lifesteal. He's going to get at least one stack of it per gorge. But Large Stone, pretty good, especially on Animus of Will. Just make sure you probably want it to get at least one upgrade into Pip, either through leveling up or like some artifact. That way you can guarantee that you can play it on the top floor, or whatever floor you end up wanting to play it on. But that initial spike to damage and health is just going to help so much. And multi-strike is, it's always valuable no matter what, really. But and you still want it here, but if you have a Furnace Tap, you don't really need to hunt for multi-strike that much, because Furnace Tap would rather just see flat increases, in my opinion, and still quickness. But all that being said, you're not always going to get Furnace Tap, and multi-strike is still going to be a good upgrade in that case, especially if you have a unit that doesn't, like, not Animus of Will. The sweepers would probably like to see Quick along with multi-strike as their ideal upgrades. And then as the flat ones, I didn't find myself typically taking too many of the cheap upgrades, but Strength Stone's probably the best one there. If you compare it to Large Stone, you're not missing out on that much initial damage. You're really just not getting that health. But if really all you care about is getting that initial damage, you're not missing out much there, and you don't have the extra pip space taken, so Strength Stone is more than okay. But that's really the upgrades I would target. And Merchant of Magic, Holdover is going to have the most targets. By far, though, Perils is going to be what you want for Holdover. You really want to hunt for Holdover on Perils. That's just giving you guaranteed 3 energy per turn. If you got Superfood, that's going to be 8 damage per turn. And even if you don't have Superfood yet, I'd still stick it on your Primordium. That's still going to give you a flat 4 per turn to your frontliner. And also... that, you know, you might have a big hit up front, and then that follow-up hit will have the extra rage to kind of deal some extra damage to maybe the second tank. That can be good in a lot of cases. Beyond that, Void Binding is always good, getting that extra damage, and especially if you're facing like Cleanse Seraph, you might even prioritize Holdover on Void instead of prioritizing Double Stack. I would say generally, though, Double Stack's what you want on Void Binding instead of Holdover, but Holdover's still fine on it. If you do go Holdover route, I would knock it down to 0 energy, especially if you don't have Perils. Then you can just keep playing it. That's a lot of damage, a lot of defense per turn. Glimmer is always a nice target as long as you have the plus 10 damage. Particularly if you're facing the 2 versions of Seraph that have Shade Wings. So that's going to be Seraph the Temperament, however you say it, and Seraph the Patient, aka Seraph the Balanced. You will probably, unless you have, if you have Quick, you're probably fine, especially if it's a sweeper unit. But if you don't, you really might want to consider Glimmer on Holdover, or else you're just going to die unless you have some serious damage shield generation. Razor Sharp Edge is always good. It has that nice early flexibility to kill backliners, but mainly it's just for scaling unit. And if you need fast scaling, you can't really, hard to beat Void Binding, but Razor Sharp Edge does a fine job as well. Knock it down to 0 Ember, put on a Holdover. That's a compounding 10 damage per turn. You just keep eating more and more of it. Grovel can be okay too if you're really in need of damage shield and you couldn't find a Void Binding, or maybe like a Prism Shard or Prism Retrieval, whatever it's called, Prismatic Dust. Grovel's pretty good there. It's cheaper than Gem Trove, so I typically prefer it, and it's knock it down to 1 energy, put on a Holdover, and it's a pretty good source of stacking damage shield on your Primordium. And then Mind Collapse, really putting this in Holdover is only going to happen if you didn't find Perils and you really find yourself needing that extra damage energy per turn. It's not a question to put plus 10 damage and Holdover and Mind Collapse in that case. Double Stack, now the rest of the upgrades have fewer high priority targets, so Double Stack really is just going to come down to Furnace Tap and Void Binding. Those are going to be by far more valuable than any other thing to put Double Stack on. Furnace Tap is, the Rage is just an added bonus, but getting 2 multi-strikes per turn if you have Superfood, which most likely you do. Even if you don't, you can still just stick it on your frontliner. That's probably going to be fine anyway, but you'll literally kill Seraph before he starts the fight. Like before he starts his actual boss relentless rounds. Multiple times I killed Seraph with a double stacked Furnace Tap on my Primordium in that way. And then Void Binding, we talked about that as well. Getting over 40 damage per turn. Pretty nice. Surge Stone, we talked about removing plinks. This is a great way to pseudo remove the plink. It is to basically, put the Surge Stone on it. It's going to be probably your top target whenever you see Surge Stone. It's basically, a free removal of it, but it makes it pretty useful the turn you play it in this case. Like it can clear the backliners, give you some morsels, and even for killing tanks, if the tank is alone, that's going to be a little over 40 damage to the tank, which can save you maybe a pyre hit or 2, even if you can't finish it off. Emberstone's just going to be everything. Emberstone's such a great upgrade. I do suspect one day it will be nerfed somehow, but until then, I say abuse it. 25 gold, every single reroll, every single shop guaranteed is pretty good. You should pretty much always try to target it on something. Permafrost, really Wretch is the only one I felt was worth calling out here. Having it on Permafrost is pretty good. There's other things you could do, like you could put a Cave In on Permafrost, but I never really found myself needing that Retch is really the main thing. You want to be able to eat back that more Primordium, whatever we're talking about here, Primordium, yep. And you might even want to be careful about eating too many morsels in that case, because remember, all the morsels will come back, and you could overdraw your hand, especially if you need to play Retch early for some reason. Always think about that. Try to look at your eaten pile, see how many are in there, see how many you want to like guarantee that it gets drawn, and then yeah, that's pretty much Retch in a nutshell. Then plus 10 magic power, always going to have some good targets. Glimmer is probably the highest one, I would say, unless Mind Collapse is like your perils option. But both of them are great plus 10 damage targets, and Tumbra's great as well. And then Plink is pretty okay with it as well. I mean, at plus 10 damage, it's a pretty useful spell. It's usually hitting the back line, like the odds are in your favor that it will hit with at least one of them, and then it'll give you a morsel as a result, so that's pretty good. So that's, I would really commit this to memory, because this is going to be a big part of how you make this work, right? And then artifacts, not a whole lot here, and I should mention the fact that there aren't a whole lot here should make it so, some combos you want to like target the Herzl hordes, or just maybe you might be a little more risky in trying to get the artifact trials. I would say this combo is not one of them. This is not like some of those Hellhorn and Stygian combos where they have such great artifacts and a plethora of them that just hunting artifacts is always like pretty good. In here, I'd say there's not a whole lot of insane artifacts. Not enough that you need to really hunt for them that hard. But all that being said, Light's Gift, the nice thing about Light's Gift is it can really carry you through the middle to early to middle game, essentially giving you a quick upgrade on your top, your top liner, which can really help when you don't have like the sustain or whatnot yet. You can even make it your end game plan if you don't end up fighting quick. Can certainly help there. Chain of Gems is nice because if you put your, make sure you put down your Primordium first, and if it has superfood, that's basically the, every additional upgrade of superfood, you just applied it with Chain of Gems, and then later on, you can, here and there, you might put down some units just to chump block, and then they have the extra damage shield. So Chain of Gems is actually one of the best artifacts you can find. Thorn Fruit, we've talked about that, but it's always good. I always love myself some Thorn Fruit. Oh, and then X-Cost cards. Not that we, other than like the prismatic dust or whatever that applies shield, they're not too many, and I guess Mind Collapse, but not too many X-Cost cards are that central to the game plan. But this is just still such a good artifact. Because Umbra has so many X-Cost cards, right? And so if you see it, even if I didn't have any X-Cost cards, I might consider it if the other options sucked. Like, it's probably worth it for me just to put it in the deck, because I'll probably get an X-Cost card at some point. We've talked about Hammered Chestplates, pretty good with the compounding health upgrade. Vapor Funnel's always pretty nice. We talked about units sort of passing through a lot. This can mitigate that a lot. The -5 is not much of a downside for getting a free hit in. Usually that free hit's going to make it so the low health units never get hit on you, and it usually saves you a pretty good chunk of health against the tanks that get through. Railsforged's Hammer is always good. I like guaranteeing that I just have that extra pip on the top floor. That way, if I put a large stone on somebody, I can just take draw upgrades. I should also mention, if you have perils, I wouldn't waste any upgrades on the Ember. I wouldn't waste like your level up upgrade on the extra Ember. I would pretty much always go pip or draw in that case, because you're always going to be locked to that 3 perils energy per turn, and you're always going to be Emberdrain most likely. The lifesteal one, not quite as good as Chain of Gems, I would say, but still pretty decent. It'll help a lot with that early survivability, and it can be a nice way to it'll transfer for a few rounds from your superfood before the superfood ends up attacking. so you get a pretty good set of lifesteal stacks in your frontliner. Refracting lenses. This one actually ends up being pretty good because of what I've talked about with losing pyre health a lot. And you'll typically have a lot of consumable cards by mid-game to end-game. And this ends up giving you a lot of health restored for your pyre. So refracting lenses is actually pretty good. And then Fossiled Fangs, even though we don't focus too much on gorge units, it's still a great artifact. And it can even allow you to maybe think more about using like an overgorger, even like an alloy in that case, because in those cases now you're getting double the gorge, and you know, maybe you have enough fuel in that case to actually take on bosses. Maybe you have enough gorge to get overgorger actually enough damage quick enough. And I put an X here on a commemorative spike. It's not a good artifact in general, but you also it'll screw you over because you'll forget that you'll be like, oh, okay, I'll take it, morsel miners, whatever. And then you realize that now you can't put your Primordium and your banner unit down turn 1 because of commemorative spike. It took up the space on the floor. So think thrice about adding this. You could add it if you want, but make sure you got the space. Let's just say that. So Seraph, how do we prepare for Seraph? Well, the Chast version isn't as bad as you'd think. I would say, since you're typically going Emberdrain builds, one of the big problems or hurdles that a lot of people find with Chast Seraph is that Pyre Wings, right? But you don't care about Pyre Wings. You're glad to see Pyre Wings. It's like, you know, you're already probably have 20 Emberdrain on you by the time they hit you. And you're getting all your energy through things like Perils or Mind Collapse anyway. Or you just have everything costing 0. In any case, it's much easier than just facing what would be in place of it with these other Seraphs, which would usually be either a Gilded Wing or the I forget the name of them, but they look like the Pyre Wings and they harvest armor. They're basically Gilded Wing, but you know, a 4 damage, 150 health or whatever it has unit is certainly not that bad to take on. So really the only downside is the debuff, you know, the buff removal. But that's really not too much of an issue because you know, as long as you have ways to reapply, particularly your damage shield, because it's not going to take away your multi-strike, it's not going to take away your flat stat increases. All of those are still going to be fine. The only time it might screw you over is if you were relying heavily on damage shield, but you didn't have a damage shield that like reapplied, it was able to reapply. So think like I can't remember the name of it. Prism Dust, the basic card that does X cost damage shield application. If that's your only if you don't have Void Bindings, if you don't have Grovel or Gem Trove, if only that X cost card is your application, you should probably think about putting Eternal Stone on it. You know, remove the consume effect. You'll miss out on a stack of damage shield when you play it, but that's definitely going to be more valuable simply to have it able to keep cycling back through the deck, because you're going to want to be able to reapply it. Especially once the boss sort of starts his relentless rounds, you should be on the top floor, and then you'll have enough time to hopefully apply enough damage shield to survive it, or lifesteal if lifesteal's your game plan. Diligent shouldn't be too hard. Diligent is always the easiest Seraph. It's just an annoying Seraph, in my opinion. You know, the thing that can suck is if you have Perils on a holdover. It can be tough because usually you want to play it as the first card of the turn. It can be tough if you don't properly prepare to actually make that happen. But I find it usually only happens when I forgot about it, because you'll be going through your run and it will never really occur to you unless you're really thinking about, oh, I have Diligent ahead of me. Because you'll stomp the run and then you'll get there and you'll be like, oh crap, I can't I'm gonna have to like burn my perils, which so much of my game plan hinges on, right? So the way around that is you just want burners. You want 0 cost burner spells, right? Like either take some 1 costs and take them down to, put an Emberstone on them, bring them down to 0, or just have some other 0 costs that you can play without needing like, you can play them before anything at 0 cost, and just so you can burn them. And you might even just hell vent your held over perils as well. That way you can play them for as long as you can, but then if you get to a turn where you need the energy but you have to play it, you can burn one of them at least, and you'll have another one coming up. That's kind of the way around that. And there's not much else there. Like, as long as you have some pyre health, you may not even worry about the scourges that are getting into your deck. Because a lot of the time you're probably not going to be able to kill those backline units, since you're still wanting to set up at the top. And then, so you're probably going to have a lot of scourges coming into the deck, but there's ways around that too. I mean, Mind Collapse, Glimmer, things like that. Oh. And then Rallying, Seraph the Patient, aka Balanced. That's going to be your, ironically, I've always thought of all the classes, Umbra would have the has the easiest time with Patient, but even then, my 7-game win streak came to an end to Patient, as all my win streaks do, because, I mean, let's be honest, Patient is so much harder than the other Seraphs. True, you can prepare for him and beat him most of the time, but let's be honest, it's freaking way harder. There's no way that it's not the hardest Seraph. But I can rant on that. Don't get me down that road. Anyway, you have to make sure you have enough HP. The reason I lost was because I couldn't find Quick. I had the artifact that made it so the top floor dazes the units, so that was my game plan. But in my opener, Seraph started at the top, and I couldn't put my dude down because he would die. Because he does, of course, crap loads of damage even right off the bat. Gets rallied too. And because of that, yeah, I died, and I didn't put him at the top. I tried to make it work in the middle, and it just didn't work. But, just make sure your dude has enough health to survive that first hit, because lo and behold, you'll be sure he'll probably start at the top, and he'll be hitting you for, 26 damage or whatever the minimum there is, probably even more. So you're probably going to want to incant as well as those 2 initial rallies, because you really still want your people at the top. You really want that buffer space. But once you start getting your damage shield engine going, it's not too much of an issue. And if you have Quick, there's not that many units coming in, so as long as you're quick, or if you didn't get Quick, if you have like Glimmer on holdover or something, as long as you can kill those Pyre Wings, get some damage shield going, you'll probably be fine. Quick and damage shield will be enough to beat his ass. And then Pride, which is literally just Seraph the Patient, but much easier. There's no additional problems that he presents, and this would be, it's funny because the sap does transfer from your superfood, but even then it's just so much easier than this. You're gonna have anywhere between 60 and 100 sap on your frontliner by the end of this fight. Trust me, it's not even that big of a deal. Like you get just so much insane damage by the time the Seraph fight is so long that by the time you've stacked everything and maybe even retched an additional set of stacks, you're still going to be doing hundreds of multi-strike damage. Or if you don't have multi-strike, you'll still be doing hundreds of damage even with 100 sap. So yeah, sap really isn't an issue. Really, it's just the same type of things. Deal with the Shade Wings and you'll be good for this fight. You'll have enough rage and enough flat damage increase that you'll counteract those saps, no problem. So the trials. Now, don't get me wrong here. On my thumb down section, I'm not saying don't take them. I'm just saying these are the ones that are going to give you trouble. If you look at most of my wins, I still took on almost every trial throughout. But if you look at my losses, usually it's because I took on these trials and I shouldn't have. All that being said, these 4 trials, the plus damage, the spikes, mark of invasion, and multi-strike, generally not going to give you any issue, no matter what your situation is. Especially early game, these will be 3 that are your early game options. First 2 circles are going to be these 3 or this one. You just pray that you don't see armor emblem. You still might take it anyway, but these 3 are just going to be easy. Plink cleans up those things, so usually the spikes aren't too relevant. The extra damage isn't too relevant, and mark of invasion can be cleaned up with plinks, hopefully. It's just armor emblem that basically makes your plinks useless, so your starting deck just only really can have stat increases, and that's it. You won't be really killing much. And then Heaven's Seal is just always freaking, much like Seraph the Patient, just so much worse than all the other trials in a general sense. Even in a strategy that involves me just sitting at the top and getting so powerful that I can just one shot everything. Even then, Heaven's Seal is the hardest trial. It's because if even one gets through, say a Gilded Wing gets through, that's a lot of fucking damage coming through to your pyre. A lot of the times Heaven's Seal is not worth it. Really, you really think if you got enough quick scaling and pyre health buffer if you're going to take Heaven's Seal. And then Ancient Hate, which is usually one of the easiest trials for most, in my opinion, for most combos, can actually account for a lot of your losses, especially, if you're relying on hitting some plinks to get some of your gorges going, or if you're relying on Mind Collapse to get your Emberdrain sort of set up, you should probably think twice about Spell Shield. Or even if you have Glimmer and whatnot that is pretty reliant on a way to kill the backliners, all of those can get hurt pretty bad from Spell Shield. Now, if pretty much your whole game plan is just stick multi-strike on your dude and scale him up, you probably don't care too much about Ancient Hate. But definitely think twice. If you do have any sort of spells, you'll probably underestimate how much you rely on. In any sort of damage spells, you may underestimate how much you rely on them, and then just find Spell Shield ends your run. So I want to just give a few. We're getting toward the end here, but I want to just let you know what some of my winning deck look like at the end. So in this example, my Primordium is not the ideal one, but so the ideal would have been that I have Buffet 8, no damage shield, and then this status. But you're not always going to get that. So in this run, I probably started Superfood, did not get offered Stalwart for my second, or for my first level up, but then got offered Stalwart at my final one. So that's how you end up that. It's not too bad. The initial damage shield is just fine, but I would say I generally prefer Buffet 8 and then the other one. My carry unit was Crucible Collector, so not one of the ideal ones, but just fine in this case. And in this case, all I did is slapped a large stone on it. That was the only upgrade. And then for the cards, I had Feast just to get some early scaling going. Invigorating Solution, good card draw. You'll see the Holdover Perils, pretty common in my winning decks. And obviously I must have started Perils here since I have 2 of them. Wretch. Now Wretch is a really good way to counter the low buffet. Wretch is, it's a rare card, so you're not always going to find it, but if you do find it, it's always good to have one of. And in this case, when I run out of my 5 buffet, I can just replay him and keep gorging and keep the train going. He won't, Primordium won't come back with the Furnace Tap multi-strike, but in this case I have 2, so if I need to, I can always replay it. Space Prism, probably just there for some extra space, but probably didn't need it by this point. Most likely I had other banner units at one point, and then just removed them to guarantee Crucible Collector. Trap Shoot, Steel Enhancer, as we said, it's just always pretty decent. Trap Shoot, I found Trap Shoot was, you're going to see my stats at the end that I go over, but surprisingly I ended up with Trap Shoot a lot. Definitely chalked it up to variance, but I will say it's generally just a good card to have. It's much like, because your main problem is tanks, it just fires one of those early tanks all the way back to the bottom, that you don't really care too much about the dazed. though it can be okay against the boss if you didn't end up using it early, just to use it to get some dazed. Trap Suit's just really good, cost 0, doesn't really need anything to make it worthy of being in your deck. Engine upgrade, you know, in this type of deck, it probably only did things in the early game. By late game, you're getting all your energy through perils anyway. But since it consumes itself, I probably just didn't need to remove it. Like, I'd rather just remove some other things. Still had some plinks, but the only plinks I have in the deck have damage upgrades. So that's kind of what's going on there. Pretty common to see. Razor Sharp Edge, made it free, pretty common to see. Still kept all my Root Seeds, pretty common to see. Root Seeds pretty good for this combo. Had the Void Binding. In this case, since I'm fighting Seraph the Chast, I don't double stack it, and I instead make it reapplyable, and then put on a holdover so I can keep reapplying it. That way I'm pretty much hard countering Seraph the Chast. And then Furnace Tap, had the double stack and made it cheaper. And probably Hellvented it with my final Hellvent. Pretty common to Hellvent Furnace Tap. You want to have the likelihood that you draw it early high, and Hellventing it sure is a good way to guarantee you that. Pretty rare for me to just have one Furnace Tap in a deck, because if I find it, I'm for sure Hellventing that shit. And then Making a Morsel, not really that good of a card, but I probably, you know, since I had Crucible Collector, it was probably to get me through the early to mid game. And then Sharpen, always decent. I started Superfood, so it's probably something I did add to my deck since I only have one, and then just make it cheaper so it's not so awkward to play. Excavation Eruption, just a decent card. Pretty common just to put 2 Ember upgrades on it, let it kill backline units and stuff. And then Artifacts, I had the Double Gorge, which would probably help Crucible Collector, though since I'm multi-striking it doesn't matter too much. But it was early, so it probably helped with the early game a lot. Then I went Draw Upgrade, probably at whatever point I got the Large Stone upgrade, I probably thought about getting that Pip upgrade. And as I said, I generally just am not getting Ember upgrades. This Draw artifact is always decent. Probably got this to help with some tank killing. I will say this Blight artifact is decent to help with the tank killing, even if it's a one-time thing. But it's especially good against the, you know, if you've faced Seraph the Diligent, the Consume version, since it shuffles Blights in at the end. And then Pyre Health, probably just took that just to get it. And then as you can see here, and I had talked about in that previous slide, you know, there's the thumbs down, but here I took on every single trial other than one. So even the bad, you know, if you get the trials, you know, this one was an armor trial, so I still took it anyway just because I could. Yeah, and that's that. That's this run. It was a win. And then here we got the old Animus win. Had 2 of them here. I probably Hellvented it at some point. And I had put on the Large Stone, the quick upgrade, and then I got this nice upgrade that makes your unit 1 pip space. So that certainly helps with the early game scaling. Even if one of your Animus Wills isn't scaling, that's still 18 by 3 damage that's gonna help you with. So you can put both of them down, same floor. And that'll certainly help killing those tanks early on. And then this one I took on every trial, you can see, because I probably just had this Animus Will going from an early capability here. And I have the Ideal Primordium here, where it's Buffet 8 with the status transfer. As for everything else, took Ember Cache. That's probably just to counter Seraph the Diligent. Ember Cache is a nice counter there. It has the initial burn, then it'll have 3 other burns later on. Couldn't find holdover on perils in this run, though it might not be that I couldn't find it. It looks like I just don't have much of an Emberdrain game plan here going on. You're not always gonna, have, I don't have Void Bindings, I don't have Furnace Tap, I don't even have the Lifesteal one, so really it probably wasn't much of a reason for me to put the holdover on perils, because I just didn't need it. Prismal Dust to get that probably some big nice spikes to my damage shield. Steel Enhancer 3. So most likely what happened here is I started the Stalwart version is my guess, because I wouldn't really have any other reason to have 3 Steel Enhancers in my deck. That Stalwart, but Stalwart really loves to see Steel Enhancer. And then Glimmer is the card I chose to put on holdover here. Probably just to have that nice AoE option. Who knows at what point I did that, but at any rate, it'll help with Seraph the Diligent to be able to kill the backliners so that I don't have Scourges getting put into the deck. And then I still have 2 Surge Stone Plinks, but removed the rest of them. Got my Root Seeds. I have a lot of Ember upgrades here. I probably, at some point, I just didn't have anything to put Ember on. And when that's the case, it's still fine to put on Root Seeds, especially against Seraph the Diligent, because that's going to allow you to have a nice burn spell. And at any rate, it's free stats and free card draw. Certainly a good thing. And Grovel for some additional shield stacking. Umberstone, probably didn't need it this run if I'm using Animus Will, but never necessarily a bad thing. Maybe at some point I had Sweepers. Excavation Eruption, just always kind of a nice card to have. And that's kind of it here. Nothing really too insane going on with the artifacts. I think I took this Ember artifact here, and actually you'll see I'm removed. It adds the 2 Vengeful Shards. It looks like I removed those Vengeful Shards here because I just didn't need the energy. It's still giving me an extra energy here, and I just didn't want those other cards shuffling through the deck. And also you'll notice so far I've still removed Trained Stewards by the end here in both these cases. And then the other ones probably weren't too relevant. I mean, I'm already quick, so this is just a nice to have. I'm probably still setting up at the top. I don't need this. And then extra health here is probably fine. And then here I got the old Shattered Shell, which is also a nice carry unit. Couldn't find the quick here, so I have Multi-Strike and it looks like a Battlestone. That Battlestone probably just helps for a little bit of initial survivability and scaling combo, but I sure would have rather had quick, I can tell you that. But sometimes you can get by without it. In this case, and it looks like in this case I didn't remove all my stewards, still had 1. Maybe I had that 1 just to chunk block if I needed it, or, well, probably not because I don't have space upgrades. But anyway, so Ensnare, always pretty good to have, helps with the early game stall. Prismal Dust, definitely want it here because I don't have any quickness and I don't have like an artifact that stuns the top floor or anything like that. Wretch, still nice even when we have Buffet 8. That'll still give you a full stack back in, and you'll keep eating throughout the boss fight, so that's a lot of extra stats still. Space Prism, probably didn't really need it here, but probably needed it like early game, just helped out. Trap Shoot, talked about Trap Shoot. Glimmer on Holdover. We are facing Seraph the Temperament, and see, this is the big thing. I couldn't find Quick, right? But I had Glimmer, and I could put it on Holdover and +10. And now if I didn't do this, I would have lost this run, hands down. Like I have a lot of shields here, but that's not enough to stop how much hits are coming in from these Shade Wings. So putting the Glimmer on Holdover with a plus damage is what allowed me to kill Seraph the Temperament in this case. Petty Theft, just kind of there, I guess. Had 1 Plink left, the rest were removed. Razor Sharp Edge, I even put that on Holdover. That's even especially nice with Shattered Shell, who doesn't start with a whole lot of attack. If you can keep that on Holdover, that's a lot of compounding stacks of +10 that'll end up getting onto Shattered Shell. And then had another one at free, so I must have started with Razor Sharp Edge most likely. Got the Root Seeds. Void Binding, I have that double stacked. That's probably went along, because this is another run. This run and this run you don't see Furnace Tap, so Void Binding is certainly a fine way to scale out your damage in the absence of it. And I will say Shattered Shell doesn't need Furnace Tap as much as a lot of the other units do. Well, that's the nice thing about Animus Will and Shattered Shell, is they don't really need Furnace Tap. Whereas like Crucible Collector and these single hitters that don't sweep really want to see Furnace Tap. They can still do it without it, but it certainly helps. And then just, Sharpen, Grovel, Umberstone. Umberstone's really good with a sweeper. Cycle of Life, probably to get some of that early health, survivability since I'm not quick. Excavation Eruption to also get maybe some AoE if I don't draw early into Glimmer. So that's all the winning deck examples I thought to go through. Now, final bit here. I just want to go over some of the stats that I gathered. So it was 21 wins and 10 losses in the run that I was interested in, which was basically I developed this strategy and played 31 games, had about a 67% win rate. The best streak I had during that was 7 wins. But I will say I think my variance was on my side. We'll see that in a little bit here, but I think maybe the deck maybe the strategy isn't necessarily as powerful as this suggests, but it is worth noting that I did go 21 and 10 at Covenant 25, which I think shows a pretty good strength level to it. It's not as strong as like some of the incant decks I've done guides for, but it's pretty good. It's a fun deck, I will say. But anyway, so of my 21 wins, we're going to go over the unit stats first. My ideal superfood, or my ideal Primordium, was achieved 15 times. So 15 of the 21 runs, I have that Stalwart Stack 2 and Superfood 1. I think variance is on my side there. Theoretically, it shouldn't be too hard to pull off because I can start with either of them, and then I'd have to lose 2 50/50s in a row not to get the Superfood 1 and Stalwart 2. So that's basically what happens there. But I guess I have to win the first 50/50, so I think variance is probably still on my side there anyway. But anyway, you know, it is kind of funny to look at this, that only 4 times did I not hit that first 50/50, it seems, so variance definitely probably on my side there. And Stalwart 2, or this should read Stalwart 3 twice. Yeah, I don't know what I did there, but basically, of my wins, 2 of them I never got offered superfood, so it's nice to know that even if you don't get the status transfer, just the flat damage is enough to still make you win. It is interesting, I only got stuck with Superfood 3 once, and it was a loss, but I don't think that Superfood 3 is necessarily weak. It's weaker than the others, but I just never ended up with it for whatever reason, because variance just didn't end up that way. But we got the Animus of Will, aka Animus of Win, coming at the most here, 12. And by the way I counted these, I didn't count if they're like 2 of in a run. I just said, was it in a run or not? So like Animus of Will is probably more than 12. You know, we saw even in the screenshot I had 2 of them in one run, but I'm just saying in 12 of my wins, Animus of Will was at least present. And that's how I'm going to count each of these in my stats here. Shattered Shell was right behind Animus of Will, so 10 wins I can attribute to Shattered Shell. Now, granted, some of those I might have Animus of Will and Shattered Shell, so Animus of Will is probably still the carry in that case, but at any rate, Shattered Shell I know is the carry in several cases, and even if it's not the carry, it's a pretty nice secondary unit to guarantee some nice AoE if you can stick quick on it. So those 2 are the most prominent. And then Crucible Collector at 7, nothing to ignore there either. It's pretty dang good card. It just doesn't really have that hardcore carry potential if you don't find Furnace Tap. That's really the only weakness of Crucible Collector. Otherwise, you know, it's a boss killing king, super strong at early to mid game. Just kind of needs some really good scaling late game to really be a carry. And Train Stewards, interesting that in 6 of the wins I didn't remove all the Train Stewards, which is pretty rare. If you know my typical strategies, Train Stewards are usually the first thing out, but this is just indicative of the fact that Plink is the first thing out usually for me in this strategy. Husk Hermit 3, you know, I talked about Shattered Shell and Husk Hermit not being that different in theory, but I will say in practice it seemed like Shattered Shell sure performed a lot better than Husk Hermit. So, you know, I might be, it's hard how you gotta chalk a bit of it up to variance, but it is worth noting that Shattered Shell did seem to perform better than Husk Hermit in the runs that I evaluated here. And then I just have a few one-ups here. Woken Hollow was my carry in one of them, so it can work. Crucible Warden, I would have thought to see Crucible Warden more, because in theory I don't think Crucible Warden is that much weaker than Collector. But it is worth noting that I guess only 1 win had Crucible Warden. Amber Forge, I mean, this card sucks. It's probably just in there and I never removed it. from the start or whatever. Vine Mother 1. This one was a little surprising to me. I typically won't skip Vine Mother unless I have like a Vine Mother already. Maybe I should though. You'll see in when I go over the losses here that there were 3 Vine Mothers in my losses. You know, there's always variance and whatnot, but I could see conceptually how Vine Mother might not be a good include, because if you think about it, it is delaying me a lot of the time being able to play my carry banner unit and get it scaling early in favor of just getting some extra draw. Maybe that extra draw is not worth like getting that initial stack. I could see that being the case. And then Wilting Sapwood. Wilting Sapwood's okay. It's not a great unit, but sometimes it's just okay to have to get you some extra Ember, tank a few hits for some backliner, maybe stick some spikes on it, kill some early game backliners. So apparently I had it in my deck in one of the wins. Then the 10 losses, I still was hitting my ideal Superfood 1, Stalwart 2 often, you know, over half the time, so in 6. And then also, you know, if you look at this, most of the losses were late game. Like the deck really is, or the combo really is pretty strong early game. Like I never lost before at least my first level up. And in fact, only 3 times did I lose between at that point. So Superfood 1, Stalwart 1 just indicates I lost before that second level up. But I never lost before Daedelus or Talos in this run. So if you do find yourself losing to them, maybe go back to my notes section that I had on Talos and Daedelus just to make sure you're preparing for it correctly. And then Train Steward 7, that's probably just indicative that I didn't have the time to remove them all, but maybe it indicates that I should have removed them sooner. Crucible Collector was in 5 of them, so you know I say this is kind of why I would say it didn't really meet my like S tier evaluation for units. Still like a good unit, but often not enough. Like if it'll get you through the early to mid, but if you don't have Furnace Tap and you don't have a better option for carry, it's probably not going to be enough for you to win come late game. Husk Hermit, and then this is where I wonder how much of this is variance, but it is worth noting it was present in 5 of my losses versus only present in 3 of the wins, versus Shattered Shell, not present in any loss, but present in 10 wins. I think there's some variance going on there, but it is worth noting. Crucible Warden, present in 3 losses. I still think it's kind of variance, but you know, take everything with a grain of salt, but don't ignore it completely just because it's a low sample size. It is worth noting that it was there in 3 losses and only there in 1 win. We've talked about Vine Mother. Overgorger I've touched on, but just didn't seem to have enough gorges to get going fast enough. You know, mid-game, I'm pretty sure my mid-game losses were probably involving Overgorger because I just couldn't get enough damage. I mean, it only has 15 HP, so it's like the survivability is not really there. It really wants to have quickness and it wants to have a lot of damage and then maybe some multi-strike. Or at least, you know, maybe some early game health. At any rate, it didn't seem to perform that well. And Animus of Will was only present in 1 loss. So both Shattered Shell and Animus of Will really goes to show how much of an effect they had on the winning, right? They're both uncommon, which is for a banner, as far as a banner unit goes, means they're common because it's the most common tier of banner unit. So you should be able to find them somewhat consistently. And yeah, seek them out because apparently they seem to have a pretty good effect on your wins or your ability to win. And then Awoken Hollow, it looks like I had him in 1 loss and Ember Forge in 1 loss. You know, not much to go over there. Now, this is the spells or just non-unit cards. So for the 21 wins, what were I have it sorted from most prominent to least. Root Seeds was always there, 21 out of 21. The only card that was never fully either non-present or fully removed. Plink, 19. So only in 2 of them did I just fully remove all Plinks. But you got to remember, most often I'm going to be putting at least a Surge Stone or a plus 10 damage on a Plink or 2. And I'm not going to remove those, right? So it actually goes to show the fact that on two of the ones I just completely removed plinks. Kind of shows how bad plink is, and how much priority I put on removing them. Perils of Production. So now we got, everything in here is kind of your common hits. Perils of Protection is always high priority. You're going to want to pick it if you don't have one. Even if you don't have any Emberdrain yet, you want to have it for when you want to plan on going Emberdrain. You're not going to hit it every time, but you want to plan on it. So getting Perils ready is good, and I would stick Holdover on it early. If anything, that's a +8 damage per turn, so that's not too shabby, even if you don't have any other Emberdrain support. Razor Sharp Edge in the same sense, that's 10 damage that compounds upon itself. Just a good card. Steel Enhancer. I probably want, I don't have time to really talk about each of these cards, but you can kind of see Steel Enhancer, Prismal Dust, Void Binding. Now, Furnace Tap, 11 of the 21, so, half, a little over half the wins involve Furnace Tap. That kind of, I don't know what that says about the strategy, right? Because Furnace Tap is a rare. Now, granted, it's a rare that I'm always going to pick if I see it, and it's also one that is readily available from a few cavern events, right? There's some cavern events that offer you Furnace Tap. But even all then, 11 seems pretty high for a rare. There's definitely no other rares that I take as much as that. So maybe if I played more and more runs, my win rate would normalize a little lower just because of how powerful Furnace Tap is. 11 seems high. It seems like I was a little lucky with how often I was finding it. Literally as much as Void Binding pretty much, or even like Perils, right? But worth noting. Grovel 11. Grovel's just pretty solid. You see a lot of these damage shield cards in here. Space Prism. I just never. Space Prism probably wasn't like super focal to anything, but you never really remove it because it's so easy to remove, and it kind of just feels good to play anyway. So probably just never felt like removing it. Probably got offered it a lot, or I probably started with it a lot, is what I should say. And Snare was really good. In 9 of the wins, it was present. It just helps for getting a pretty non-awkward way to stall things. Glimmer, always good AoE to see. Mind Collapse, always good. Preserve Thorns is always good. And then, so on and so forth. Wretch was there a pretty good amount of time. Trap Shoot, that one was funny to me. 6 times. That's a pretty high amount for a Cavern event card, right? But that being said, you could almost say that you could compare that to Furnace Tap. It's not, Trap Shoot is probably easier to find from caverns, but Furnace Tap probably is some certain subset of that 6, you could say. Just because it's like there's only so many rares, and if you choose like the rare cavern event, for instance, your chances are okay that you find Furnace Tap. But if you say like give me a rare Umbra card, right? Or let me choose from rare Umbra trap picks. Umbra Stone's up there, and then so on. Immortal Trade, you know, of the Embers ones, definitely the least prominent one was Immortal Trade. Still, I like the card, but it just is not on the power level of those other ones because it doesn't give stats. It really is the main thing. And then I probably won't go. You can look at all these yourself and make your own conclusions there. But then as far as the losses are concerned, still removed all the planks in one of the losses. Apparently wasn't enough. Root Seeds are there. Space. It is funny also. Let's see, what was the Train Steward? So yeah, 7 Train Stewards. Yeah, whatever. So yeah, it is interesting. Probably some variance going on here, but like Glimmer, even though it was present in 9 wins, it was also present in 6 losses. I don't know if there's really much to glean there. Sting, it looks like I might have taken too often. It's only there in 3 wins versus the 5, 50% of the losses. I don't know. It's possibly not great. I do like stings, but maybe since I use them so often in Incant, I may have started overvaluing stings a little bit. Entumbra Assault, that's an interesting, I talked about, let's see, it's only there in 3 wins, present in 4 losses, so just kind of goes to show Entumbra Assault is usually really good, but in this combo it's not that good. If you did a normal analysis of normal old school Umbra, you would see Entumbra Assault present in a lot of the wins. It would be kind of on the level of a Perils of Production, but in this one it's just not that good. Not that good. It's not bad, but it's not that good. Gem Trove, probably the weakest of the the damage shield cards. I still was there in a good amount of the wins because it is damage shield, but if it is what you have to rely on for damage shield, it's not great. It's not a great situation to be in. Hopefully you find better options later on, and these I probably didn't find them in time and just died because it's so much energy to put in just for 1 damage shield. Immortal Trade, present in 4 losses, probably just doesn't do enough other than help for killing bosses, right? And then other cards, it's I still am adding, even Furnace Tap is present in 3 of the losses, so it's not like finding Furnace Tap is auto win, right? You don't want to get too cocky. And I probably had superfood in most of those cases. In fact, I did, because if you look at my losses, every single one had superfood at the time of the loss. So even stacking Furnace Tap in 3 of these cases was not enough. So don't think that it's just, find Furnace Tap or not. There's still a lot of other strategy to go into all this. And that's kind of everything else here. Don't know if there's really much else to go over. That is probably going to do it. Let me think. Yeah, I don't really have anything more to go over here. Hopefully you found this helpful. It is probably one of the less straightforward ones that I have. Less straightforward guides, but that's just kind of how it is. It's not as easy as some of the other strategies, but hopefully you can look at what my ending deck my ending decks look like and the run stats to get an idea of what you want to be looking for on each run. As always, probably this guide's a good place to start, but you should look at the runs. I upload the full runs. And to get the full, if you're really curious about specific early game, mid and late game things, your best bet is probably just to watch my runs. I do try to add commentary when I can. I'd say maybe 75% of my videos have commentary. Some of them are just sort of background music and whatnot. But yeah, that's about it. Hopefully that helps. And until next time, see you later.